webinar. Um, I think a lot of people are getting used to virtual meetings. Some people don't like them at all. Other people like them. At the same time, it's not quite the same as getting together face to face, but we'll do the best we can. So a few months ago, Landy asked me to talk about my management program, and I'm glad to do that. I've shared this information with a couple other chapters as well, branches. And there we go. So tonight, you don't need to worry about taking great notes. Or if you want a copy of the presentation, you can send me an email, john.a.gaut@gmail.com. This email address will come up at the end as well. You can get it there. So my management will go through my background just quickly. I think most of you have seen my background before. We'll talk about mite management. What is mite management? And also talk about what really kills the colonies in the winter. And then we'll get to the treatment plan. And last but not least, I'm developing a presentation on beekeeping myth busting, and the one part about mite management is related to apivar, bad badges, and resistant mites. So we'll have a little beekeeping myth busting at the end. So my background, I started beekeeping when I was 9 years old in the 60s, late 60s. I was a Boy Scout and Eagle Scout, and one of the merit badges I had was a beekeeping merit badge. And I grew up on a dairy farm, and I had 12 to 14 hives when I was in high school on the farm. And they produced a fair amount of honey. We had alfalfa growing in the field, so a lot of the honey was from alfalfa. I was able to produce a little bit of comb honey. At that time, you made comb honey in basswood sections. Don't see much of that anymore. That American foul brood and European foul brood were the main concerns. Remember treating prophylactically with terramycin, but there was actually came in a tablet that you put in sugar syrup in the spring to treat. And since then, they found out that's not an effective way to use terramycin. Actually, it works good for European foul brood, but not in a sugar solution. The bees certainly need a lot less management then. I'd check the hives maybe once a month, make sure they had enough room for honey, catch a swarm once in a while, and had a lot of bee calls around the area, including removals. There was one removal I did in a bonded whiskey warehouse. The bees had built a colony in between the outside shutters and the inside shutters of this warehouse. And everybody wanted to know if that honey tasted like whiskey. Not really, it tasted like regular honey. And at that point in time, there was no mites. Nobody ever dreamed that there would be mites on bees. There were no tracheal mites. There were no Varroa mites at all. So I don't usually share how many colonies I have. It's because so the last part says here, beekeeping is about how well you do with the colonies you have under your care. It's not really about how many colonies you have. But to lead into the mite management, I wanted to give myself a little credibility, at least. In the last 3 seasons, I really haven't lost any colonies, production-sized colonies, over the winter or the summer, which is kind of amazing. Typically, you'd have some losses over the winter and maybe even a few losses over the summer. You'd have a colony just collapse for, what was no apparent reason, really. Nukes, I overwinter a lot of nukes, and I'll lose a few there, but I'm getting better and better at overwintering nukes. So, if you add everything up together, over 3 years, 289 colony years, if you will, about 5% losses. And most of those, all of those really are in the nukes. So, I've got a lot of confidence in my mite management plan, and I'll share it with you all. You can take a look at what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and then make your own decision and see if it makes sense for yourself. Now, I titled this Mite Management, which is different than how to treat for mites and so forth and et cetera. And, it's really more than just killing the mites. That's why I call it mite management. There's a lot of different steps to it that make it successful. So mite management, you really need to understand the virus infections in the colonies, and you need to understand the biology of the Varroa mite itself. Also need to understand the population dynamics of the colony and the mites together. Then develop a plan that includes testing and treatment. I'll say this a few times, but I think testing is just as important as treatment. There's a lot of people that plan but don't execute. If you got to execute the plan. I know that everybody's busy. Bees can be a lot of work sometimes, but you've really got to execute the plan. Then assess the results. Again, testing comes in there, and if you're not getting the results you expect, or even if you are, then work at developing an improved plan and incorporating any new information. New information might include just better ways to use an existing treatment or a new treatment that may be coming along. Bottom line is, successful beekeepers are successful mite managers. Another way to say that, unsuccessful mite managers are really good mite keepers. So I had a call, this was last year. Somebody thought their colony was queenless because I saw a lot less activity in the colony. And they really hadn't gone into the colony, but as soon as I got in the colony, I saw brood that looked very much like this, kind of a spotty pattern. And some beekeepers might think that this is just maybe a bad queen or maybe European foul brood or some other disease. But here's a closer picture of it. This is Varroa mite syndrome, parasitic mite syndrome. The mites have parasitized the larva and pupa in this colony. And you can almost, here's a pupa here. Hopefully your screen resolution is good. This is a young pupa, white eyes, but it's been uncapped. This pupa is probably sending out a little bit of a distress signal saying, hey, I'm being parasitized. A bee's come along and uncapped it. Here's some pupa that have been uncapped and there's partially chewed out. Here's a capping over here that's just started to be opened. And so this will be next. Here's some larva that is actually slumped on in the cells. And again, this is probably due to bacteria and maybe viruses that the mites have transmitted. And the bacteria, the virus ends up infecting the larva as well, and they die. And so they're just kind of slumped on the cell. So, all signs of parasitic mite syndrome. For comparison, European foul brood looks different. You don't really see pupa cells uncapped. European foul brood, the larva die before the larva is capped and becomes a pupa. Again, I'm not sure your screen resolution, but here's a young larva here that's got some worker jelly with it, and it's nice and white and clear. Here's a larva here that's kind of yellow, and you can see the food is kind of yellow as well. That food is has a lot of bacteria in it. The larva is eating that bacteria, and it's really suffering, I think, because of the bacteria that's in its intestinal system. These larvae here look fine. They're healthy. They're white and so forth. But here's another larva right beside it. And if this larva isn't dead, it's going to be dead pretty quickly. It's kind of like a light coffee colored, but you can also see the white tracheal tubes in the larvae with European foul brood. Here's another larva. Hopefully you can see the tracheal tubes. This larva here is dead, but you can see the white tracheal tube still shown in this dead larva. So again, this is European foul brood. Looks different than, let me go back one slide, than parasitic mite syndrome, where you've got cap brood that's being opened up. You've got pupa that don't have a capping on it, and you have pupa that are being chewed down. And the larva that is there is kind of slumped down in the cell. And people might think something like that looks like an American foul brood as well. Again, difference between parasitic mite syndrome, European foul brood, and American foul brood. Here you see some uncapping, but you see like little pinholes here and sunken cappings. This is very typical of American foul brood. Here's a cell that's been uncapped, and you can see the what was the pupa there has really just kind of all melted down to the bottom of that cell. Here's some pupa that are in the process of melting down. This will form scales on the bottom of the cells. If you put a toothpick or a small stick in here, it'll rope out. This stuff becomes gooey and gluey. And again, let me go back one slide, European foul brood, and another slide, parasitic mite syndrome. So you can see the differences between these different brood diseases, really. Parasitic mite syndrome has probably got a lot of viruses interacting with the larva, as well as some bacteria, whereas European foul brood and American foul brood are strictly bacterial diseases. So for parasitic mite syndrome, also known as Varroa mite syndrome, you'll see bald brood. You'll see the brood being chewed down, and you'll see the melted larva in the cell. If you want a copy of the presentation, I have these links there that give you a lot more information about parasitic mite syndrome. So what really kills colonies in the winter? I listed a few things here. A lot of people think that the weather kills the colonies in the winter. You'll hear people say, oh, the cold snap killed my bees, or a false spring killed my bees. And while I hate to hear people losing the colonies, that's probably not the root cause of their demise. Bees have been around for eons, and there's always been cold snaps, and there's always been false springs, and they somehow survive. Pesticides, probably not in the winter. Diseases, American foul brood, European foul brood, chalk brood, to name a few. Those certainly can weaken a colony, but those are usually, again, brood diseases when brood is active. So those are more in the summer or fall, not necessarily in the winter. Small cluster. The cluster does need to be a certain size. It's amazing to me how small the cluster can survive if they're healthy. I've been able to overwinter 2 frames of bees in mating nukes this past year. And again, it was a little bit of a milder winter, but I didn't think they were going to make it, but surprisingly they did. And I think that a part of it is because they were healthy bees, because they didn't have mites. I'm sure another part was how I prepared them for the winter too. Poor queen. I raise queens, and I talk with people about the queen is only part of the colony. She's the ovary of the colonies, if you will. She needs a support force. If her support force, the bees around her, are not healthy, you can have the best queen in the world, and the colony is not going to make it. Starvation. People lose colonies due to starvation. Actually, this year, it was nice weather. The colonies built up. Then we had cold weather. And I found a few colonies that I needed to unexpectedly feed. But, that's part of being a beekeeper, is looking at what your colonies need and feeding them if necessary. Predators, bears can knock over colonies. But again, as a beekeeper, need to protect your bees. Your bees are being dependent on you to protect them from predators. Varroa, yeah, Varroa kills a lot of colonies in the winter. Probably the vast majority of losses in the winter are due to Varroa, not some of the other things on this list. So what really kills the colonies in the winter? Well, it's these amazing, I'm not sure they're animals or, but the viruses, right? And actually, I made this presentation before the latest virus epidemic, right? So I'm not being anthropomorphic here. But the colony really dies from a virus epidemic. The viruses build up in a colony, and the bees get weaker and weaker. The bees can spread the viruses between themselves. They feed each other. They're in close contact with each other, so the viruses can spread pretty quickly. And how the viruses get in the colony? Well, the mites bring the viruses into the colony. I tried to get a little bit of data about the viruses in the colony. There's really like 18 to 20 viruses that are known in beekeeping colonies. This was really a survey that, the USDA gets samples of bees that have died. And in 2013, they did a lot of virus assays on the samples that they got. And they, so this is the prevalence of the viruses in all the samples that they received. Black queen cell virus was very prevalent. Again, I hate to see this because I raise queens, and if a queen doesn't emerge, I'm constantly looking to see why it didn't emerge. I don't want to see a black queen, that's for sure, that has died in the cell. Deformed wing virus, we see a lot of this, right, in colonies that are weak and have a lot of mite parasitism. Lake cyanide virus too, pretty prevalent. Again, this is this is where it was first discovered, but that doesn't mean that's where it came from necessarily. Acute bee paralysis virus, Keshnev bee virus, Israeli acute paralysis virus, chronic bee paralysis virus, and so forth. So you notice a lot of these viruses cause paralysis in the bees. Deformed wing virus, now those bees are smaller, they're weaker right out of the cell, that they die pretty soon after emerging. Either they die or they're dragged out of the colony. So, the viruses, a bee in the winter needs to use its wing muscles to generate heat, right? And if the bee has a paralysis virus, its wing muscles are not going to work very well, and it's not going to generate as much heat or any heat at all like it would if it wasn't parasitized. That might explain why some big, strong colonies with a lot of bees just aren't able to keep the cluster warm, and they die. So, talked about needing to understand the dynamics of the bee population and the mite population. I think this graphic summarizes it pretty well. There's 3 lines on here, one for the bees, one for the brood, and one for the Varroa mites. Let's take a look at the bees. The bees population starts increasing in the spring, peaks around late summer, and then starts declining as we come into fall. The brood is a little bit ahead of that, right? The bees build a lot of brood. The brood actually peaks at the beginning of the summer, and as it emerges, the bee population increases then too. But then it starts through late summer is decreasing, and actually the brood that's produced in the late summer, now this is going to be the winter bees that'll take this colony through the winter. Winter bees are different than summer bees, right? Winter bees will live 6 months instead of a summer bee that might live at the most 45 days. And so you have this population of winter bees that takes the colony through the autumn and the winter. You can start out the spring with a low mite count, but as you go, as a brood is produced, that's a mite factory as well, and the mites keep increasing. And you can see that the mite population lags behind both the brood, of course, because that's where the mites are coming from, but the overall bee population. So at this point here, you have a lot of mites, you don't have a lot of bees, and you have all these winter bees. And so if you have high mites here going into the winter, you're going to have a lot of parasitized winter bees. The Varroa mite biology. Let's take a look at this. Here's a bee with a mite on it. So this mite jumps into a cell that is going to be capped. It's still got a larva in it. There's still some worker jelly at the bottom of this cell. The mite buries itself in that jelly, sticks up a snorkel so it can breathe, and waits for the cell to be capped. Once the cell's capped, this mite, this female mite, the Thondrus mite, lays an egg. A couple days later now, the Thondrus mite lays another egg, but in the meantime, that first egg has hatched. This is now a male. The first mite is a male. And a couple days later, now the female lays another egg, but you have the male mite, and you have now a female has emerged. A couple days later, still have the Thondrus mite. This male mite has matured. He's got a couple sisters here with him, and another egg. A couple days later, the mite's still here. Now the male mite has mated with one of the female mites in this colony. A couple more female mites have still in there, and there's another egg. A couple days later, the female mites there. Now you have the male mite and two mature females, two immature females. A couple days later, now you have the pupa just about ready to come out, and if it's a worker, you have the original Thondrus mite plus two of her daughters. The male mite dies right away, and the two immature females mites die as well. But so, cap brood here in a worker is 12 days. So in every 12 days, you can triple the number of mites that you have in a colony. If this was a drone, the mite would be in here a little bit longer. You would actually have 3 daughters coming out plus the original mites. So in drone brood, you can quadruple the number of mites instead of 12 days. Drone brood is more like 16, 17 days. So the result is that the bee population goes up, and you can have a kind of a low mite count in June and July. But then in the fall, as the mite population starts, or as the bee population starts to decrease, the mite population is still increasing. So you can end up with a very high mite count in September and October. And again, that's right at the time whenever the winter bees are starting to assume their responsibilities in the colony. They're not going to be able to do a good job if they're loaded with mites. So winter bees, talked about them being a little different than the summer bees. The winter bees live from September until April. They're physiologically different from summer bees. One of the main differences is they've got a lot of vitellogenin stored in their bodies, fat bodies. Some people just call them fat bees because as compared to foragers, foragers need to be light so they can fly. They don't have very much vitellogenin in their body at all. The winter bees must be healthy. What do I mean by healthy? That means they've got to have low viruses. Healthy summer bees are needed to raise these healthy winter bees, though. The bees that raise the winter bees are reared in July and August. We saw that on that one diagram. The mites are the vector for those viruses. So therefore, the mite levels need to be undetectable in July and August. Undetectable means when you ever do a mite wash, it should be 0 or 1. It shouldn't. There's a standard out there of 3%, which means like 9 mites and 300 bees. That's too high. That's too many mites. Viruses will be circulating in the colony. So there's options for treating Varroa mites. Here's a list that I've got from a website that lists out the different options. Apivar, certainly a highly effective treatment. Apistan, I put an X through that. It's really not effective. Same with check mite. Apigard is effective, but it's not something I use. Apilifar, again, it's effective. I don't use it. I've used both of these, Apigard and Apilifar, in the past. I just don't use them now. Mite Away Quick Strips, or the new formulation Formic Pro, highly effective. Oxalic acid can be effective if it's used properly. By used properly, I mean while the colony is broodless. There's HopGuard out there, and that's got mixed reviews. I consider it not effective. Powdered sugar, it's been demonstrated that that's not effective as well. So the 3 treatments that I use is Apivar, Formic Pro, and oxalic acid. I use that in a limited way, only in certain situations. Apivar, I use 1 strip for every 5 frames of bees. That's the label directions. I move and scrape the strips after 4 weeks. This is a manufacturer's recommendation to do this. You move the strips to where the colony, the cluster is, and also depending on the genetics of the bees, some bees will propolize or put wax on the strips. Some bees colonies will do that more than others. But if you scrape those strips after about halfway through the treatment, that again clears off that strip so that the active ingredient, the amitraz, can come out of the strip and do its job. Again, Apivar has amitraz in it, and it's a contact miticide. Use it for the full 8 weeks. I leave it in for the full 8 weeks. I see beekeepers take it out after 6 weeks, and to me, that's you're only getting 75% of your money's worth out of it. The labels say from 42 days to 56 days, 6 weeks to 8 weeks. You need to leave it in for the 8 weeks to have it be fully effective. But one caveat is the 8 weeks of effectiveness starts when the package is opened. I know that some people only need 2 strips or 4 strips, and they'll share, which is fine, but that means that you can't leave the strips laying around. You also have to be careful when you're handling them. You need to handle the strips with proper gloves that don't get the chemical amitraz on your skin. Again, it's a contact miticide, so it'll get absorbed into your skin as well. But if you're sharing Apivar with somebody else, they put in the plastic bag, that's not preserving it at all. That's a good practice from the standpoint of safety, but as soon as that package is opened, the amitraz starts wicking out of that plastic strip. Once it's in contact with the air, specifically the moisture in the air, it starts degrading. So, if you've got a package that somebody opened a week ago, there's really only 7 weeks of effectiveness left in that package. And certainly if it's 2 weeks, you're losing a lot of the effectiveness. Formic Pro, used Mite Away Quick Strips for many years successfully in Formic Pro. The biggest disadvantage of Formic Pro is temperature sensitive. But I've found that I use a full pad treatment, and it's 95% effective. Formic Pro is the only treatment that'll kill those mites under the brood cappings. The Apivar is effective because it's in a colony for 8 weeks and it's a contact miticide. Formic Pro will penetrate those brood cappings and kill the mites under the cappings. Formic Pro could result in a queen loss. So plan to requeen. I like to requeen. I like to put fall queens in my colonies anyway. So after I treat with Formic Pro, I'm ready to put new queens in a colony if there are any losses. I got to tell you though that it's really only the older queens that seem to have losses. A queen that's less than a year old, rarely are those queens lost. I haven't really found queen loss to be a problem for me. Oxalic acid, it's really only effective when a colony is broodless. I know that there's a lot of people that repeat oxalic acid applications over and over again to try to get around there being brood in the colony. I'm not sure that has all the certainly oxalic acid will kill the phoretic mites. It doesn't kill the mites in the brood. So you always end up with a few mites in the brood. So it's not going to be as effective whenever you have brood in the colony as, let's say, Apivar or Formic Pro. The current thinking too, at least amongst some beekeepers that have experiences, you should only treat each generation of bees once with the oxalic acid. The analogy I heard Jerry Haynes, now the editor of Bee Culture, and says, imagine yourself locked in a closet, and somebody applies this oxalic acid vapor in a closet, and you might be coughing and gagging, but you're going to survive that. But now if they repeat that every couple days, it's probably not going to do you any good. The oxalic acid changes the microbiome in a hive. Honestly, I think Formic Pro changes a little bit too. But so, if you're only using Formic Pro once or oxalic acid once, the colony can recover from that. But repeated treatments of oxalic acid, you're keeping, you're changing the pH in the hive and maybe some other things as well. Dribble's much safer for the beekeeper. If you're going to use the vaporizer, you need to use a full respirator with the proper cartridges. You see beekeepers using various kinds of respirators that end up not being effective for organic acids like oxalic acid. One great use of oxalic acid is, especially this time of year when there's so many swarms, is to use it on swarms. If you got a swarm from an unknown source and you don't know what the mites are, treat it with oxalic acid. Again, there's no brood in the swarm, and if you put a swarm in a box, it's going to take a couple days for the queen to start laying eggs. So if you can treat that swarm in a box the first couple days, it's going to be highly effective. Once there's brood, now it's going to be less effective. Actually, I had a question sent to me by somebody in the branch. They said, do you know if it's possible to overtreat with oxalic acid vaporization? Hypothetically, if I treated my hive once a week with oxalic acid, would it be detrimental over time? Said it's such an effective method, it's easy and inexpensive for treatment. And just use his initials here. It's the person that submitted it. So the premise is that it's effective. Again, it doesn't kill the mites in the brood. So it's not as effective as other treatments when there's brood present. And the effectiveness of it, from what I've seen in a few studies, is that it varies quite a bit. I mean, I have vaporizer equipment performance variability here, but you could have a great vaporizer, but if the operator is not using it correctly, it's not going to have good performance. And some vaporizers aren't that great either. Depends on the temperature and so forth. And I talked about that Jerry Hayes and others are suggested you should only treat each generation of bees once. And the other question is, Jerry Hayes says, well, it's fine to treat the each generation of bees only once, but the queen's going to be in there for multiple generations and maybe for multiple treatments. And does that have an effect on a queen? It very well may. It coats the bees in the hive with an acid. It disrupts the normal pH of the colony. So while it's inexpensive for treatment, I got to wonder if it's penny wise and pound foolish, though. If you've got any number of colonies, it does take a fair amount of time to treat them with oxalic acid. And all right, so we've talked about mites. We've talked about what the treatment options are and so forth. Let's develop a plan. And I think in terms of threes a lot of times. 3 objectives, there are 3 goals, and there's 3 tactics. And we'll end up with an annual plan. So the mite management objectives, alluded to this a little bit earlier. We want low mite levels in the colony in the early spring. Second objective, we want to raise healthy nurse bees in July and August. And then the third objective is we want to raise healthy winter bees in September, October, and November. Goals to support those objectives. These are specific now. So to start the spring build up with low levels of mites, we want 0 mites in the alcohol wash, ideally. Certainly no more than 1%. I like to see 0 or 1 mite per 300 bees. So that's like 0% or 0.03%. Trouble is that, there's cold temperatures and the colony is often clustered in the early spring. Want undetectable mite levels in July and August. There's brood present. The bees that raise the winter bees, though, that brood that's emerging is going to be the bees that raise the winter bees. At the same time, honey supers may be on the hive, and temperatures are often above 90 degrees. It was nice and warm today. And the third goal, to maintain low levels in September and October, November. Again, there's going to be brood present, but now there's an additional challenge. I've seen this year after year, is that if there's a colony around that has high mite levels, oftentimes they'll collapse in September, October, November. And a strong colony will find that collapsing colony and go and rob it out. In a process that'll bring mites back. But the other thing is that colony that's collapsing, those bees will drift out of that colony. They'll find a queen right strong colony and go into that colony, and they'll bring the mites into it. So you can have a nice strong colony that's got very low mite levels at the beginning of September, and by the end of September, it's got high mite levels. It didn't come from the brood in the colony. It came from outside the colony. The mites immigrated in from a collapsing colony. And you can have 4 colonies lined up side by side, and one colony will have high mites and the other 3 won't. It's because one colony found this collapsing colony and robbed it out and brought all the mites back. So again, want to have low mites in the early spring for the spring buildup. Want to have undetectable mite levels in July and August, and want to maintain low levels in September, October, and November. So how do we do that? What are the tactics? Start the spring buildup with low mite levels. This is my approach. I put apivar strips in the colonies in late winter. I put in 1 Apivar strip for every 5 frames of bees. There's usually a cluster of bees that's across between 6 and 8 frames in the top box, and I put two strips in. After 4 weeks, I'll move those strips to, if the cluster's moved, and I'll scrape them to make sure that they're fully active. And then I'll remove them after 8 weeks and 2 weeks before I put the honey supers on. In July and August, to achieve undetectable mite levels, need a highly effective treatment that kills all the mites, including under the cappings. Formic Pro is the only thing that can do that. A 2-pad treatment is necessary to do that. I talked with the manufacturer about 1 pad versus 2 pads, and the Formic Pro folks talk about the 1 pad, certainly is 1 pad and followed by the 2nd pad 10 days later. And that treatment regimen is not as effective as the 2 pads at the same time. And the reason is what the manufacturer said was that the single pad just really doesn't have enough formic acid vapors that are strong enough to penetrate all the cappings. It'll certainly penetrate the cappings in the area of that 1 pad, but around the perimeter of the hive, for example, where the drone brood is, and the mites typically hang out where the drone brood is, might not penetrate that capping as well. But the 2 pads together, now you have a higher level of formic acid vapors in the hive, and that's penetrates more of the cappings throughout the hive, therefore kills more of the mites. Again, may need to requeen after treatment. Oftentimes a queen will stop laying during the treatment, but she'll come back. But sometimes if the queen's in the wrong place at the wrong time, she may not make it. If it's an older queen, 2 years, the 2-year-old queen or older, she may not make it either. At the same time, I've had plenty of queens that are older that haven't, that have been fine with the full treatment of Formic Pro. But, just something you need to be aware of. And then to maintain low levels in September, October, and November, you need an extended release miticide to kill all the migrating mites. You have all these mites immigrating into the hive, and it could be in September, it could be in October, it could be in November. Could have multiple sieges on the hive coming in those periods of time. In other words, there's multiple colonies around collapsing. So you need to have a miticide that can kill those mites almost as fast as they're coming in. Apivar is really the only thing that I know of that's an extended treatment that can do that. So I put in 4 strips of Apivar because typically I've got 2 deeps. I've got 20 frames of bees, and that really protects the colony from mite immigration during that time whenever other colonies may be collapsing. But again, I move and scrape those strips after 4 weeks, and I leave it in for the full 8 weeks. The instructions label in the United States is 8 weeks. Same formulation in Europe. I'll tell you is that they it's 10 weeks in Europe. So if you, I would say follow the label, that's for sure. But if I can't get it out at 8 weeks, I don't take it out early. I might leave it in for a few days longer just to get the full effectiveness of the treatment. Probably can't read this, but included this in a presentation for those that may want to copy. And so this is my mite management plan. Don't know if you can see it, but my plan was on January 20th this year to treat with Apivar and put 2 strips in the cluster. Actually, there was a warm period beginning of January, January 11th. I got a lot of Apivar strips in that day. This goes pretty quickly, especially if you have somebody helping you. I could, but not necessary. it could be a warm, sunny day, warm being maybe 30 degrees kind of thing, no wind, and you can lift up the top cover and the inner cover. Usually the cluster's right there. Gently put 2 strips in. You don't want to force them in to the cluster. You might kill a few bees, including the queen. So you want to gently put them in. Then 4 weeks later, the plan was January or February 17th, but again there was some warm weather. Took advantage of that. February 4th, move the strips of the clusters moved. Very, very important. If the strips where the bees aren't, it's not going to work. And again, scrape those strips to make sure they stay active. And then March 18th, I removed the strips. Since I put them in early, I took them out a little bit early, March 11th. April 1st, here in this area, is whenever I wanted to start getting the honey supers on. So I go in, I usually do an inspection at that point, look to see how the queen's doing, look at the brood pattern. And it's very quick and easy to do an alcohol wash at the same time. You're pulling frames anyway, frame with some brood on it, but not the queen. Shake 300 bees off of that and do an alcohol wash. And the last step then on April 1st is to put the honey supers on. And then I don't really check again for another 6 weeks or so, middle of May. I used to check more frequently, but found that in the spring that if you've got low mites in April 1st, they're not going to build up very quickly. So May 15th is a good mid-season check. This year it took me a little longer to get around to all the colonies, and I still have a few to do. But again, as I'm doing inspections, I'm doing my washes. If I see something that's out of line, and what's out of line, for example, there was a colony that had 3 mites in 300 bees. That was a little high. I want to go back and do another wash on that colony. But excuse me, I know I need to keep an eye on that colony, and definitely that might be a colony, or that the yard where that colony is might be an option to treat that a little bit earlier if the mite levels keep going up. July 5th, I plan on doing another alcohol wash, and then that's to get a mite count before treatment. Then I'll follow that up with the Formic Pro treatment. And again, it's 2 pads, so it kills all the mites under the cap brood cells. And then the Formic Pro, the Mite Away quick strips really were primary active for 3 days, and then after 3 days, the formic acid was pretty much out of it. The Formic Pro, it's a slower release, that's why it's more advantageous. So it's still active for at least 5 days, more like 10 days. So you want to let it in there to do its full job, and then about 2 weeks or 3 weeks after putting the Formic Pro in, come back and do another alcohol wash. The honey supers are on the hives at this point, but around September 18th, I'm taking the honey supers off, doing another mite check while I'm in the colonies, and then inserting Apivar in the colony. So again, I'm at the colony, I'm taking the honey supers off, doing an alcohol wash, and then applying Apivar. 1 strip for every 5 frames of bees. Typically, there's 20 frames of bees in these colonies in September. Fair amount of brood. I like to try to requeen in the fall with fall queens. Those queens will typically lay a fair amount of brood, so that they need 4 strips in the fall. Again, after 4 weeks, moving and scraping the Apivar, and then after 8 weeks, I'm removing it, and then doing another alcohol wash to verify that the treatment worked. It's tough doing an alcohol wash around Thanksgiving, right? The weather may not be cooperative as with you. So mite management, it's much more than just treating a colony and hoping for the best. Successful beekeepers develop a solid understanding of mite, varroa mite biology and the seasonal dynamics of both the honeybee and the population and the mite population in the colony. And I hope the information I had previously gives you a good understanding. Successful beekeepers anticipate the needs of the colony by planning to both test and treat during the year. Aggressively test, aggressively treat. I've really, after dealing with mice for a few years, definitely think that testing is just as important as treating. You really don't know what you have, good, bad, or indifferent, unless you test, both before and after treatment. Yeah, you can test after treatment and get a high mite count, but if you don't know what you went in with, you don't know if how effective it was. Execution of the plan, I adjusted based on the testing and any new information. I keep records, and I'm constantly trying to think of ways to improve the plan. The plan that you just saw has been pretty much fine-tuned that way over the last couple of years. I'm happy with it right now. But really, as a beekeeper, developing your mite management skills is a very, very important beekeeping skill. There's a lot of different skills you got to have as a beekeeper, but mite management's an important one. So if you're a good mite manager, you'll have strong colonies. They'll survive the winter. And it's amazing to me how strong they survive the winter and how productive they are the next season. So with that, may have been some questions coming in. I haven't been watching the chat. Justin, is there anything that people are asking about?
So you actually only have 2 questions.
Okay.
Ben asked, how many of your hives do you do mite tests on? And so, what percentage of hives are you actively testing?
Ben, that's an excellent question. So, Ben, I try to mite check, mite test, alcohol wash all my hives. Whether there's 2 hives in a yard or 20 hives in a yard, I check them all. And the idea of a sentinel hive or a couple sentinel hives in a yard doesn't make sense to me, because I look at it as like a deck of cards. And let's say that there's a colony in the yard that has a high mite count, and you pick some, and let's say that's the ace of spades, for example. Well, you pick a couple of the colonies in the yard, it could be 5%, it could be 10% or whatever. The chances of you finding that colony that's got a high mite count are pretty small. And so and that colony with a high mite count will become a mite bomb for all the other colonies in that yard. You could test, let's say you have a yard with 10 colonies in it. You can check 3 of them and they all are fine. But number 6 colony has a high mite count. That number 6 colony collapses and it'll spread mites to all the other colonies in that yard. And you'll be scratching your head wondering what happened. You'll say, oh, the Apivar didn't work, or the Formic Pro didn't work, or the Apigard didn't work, or whatever. Well, it probably did work, but you didn't know that you had a mite bomb sitting there at the same time. And again, doing an alcohol wash while you're inspecting the hive anyway literally only takes another minute or 2 to do. If you have somebody working with you, it goes very, very quickly. You got to be organized to do that. You got to be prepared to do an alcohol wash. You got to, whatever you shake the bees into, you got to have it ready. You've got to have your measuring cup ready. You got to have the alcohol ready. But it doesn't take that much more time. Hopefully that makes sense. I know some people think it's crazy talk to check every hive, but I'm not the only one that thinks that way.
So you have some more questions. Adriana asks, isn't the weather too hot in July and August for formic acid?
No. So that was a quick answer, right? So oftentimes it is too hot, and sometimes in July. And I was thinking about putting a little bit of graphic up here of the temperatures. So if you just look at the average temperatures in July and August, yeah, it's hot, right? But every year there's sometime in July that it gets cool. Oftentimes it's after a cold front goes through, and the next couple days are going to be cool, less than 80 degrees. So I wait for that weather, that window of opportunity to apply the Formic Pro. I have the Formic Pro ready to go, and I actually put the Formic Pro in the freezer to cool it down, to slow down the release of the Formic Pro. I did that with the Mite Away quick strips. I got to tell you, with the Formic Pro, it's probably less necessary to do that. But the other thing, a couple important points with the Formic Pro is that you want to not apply it after an inspection of the colony. You want to have the colony nice and calm, not all riled up because you just went through an inspection. You need to go to the colony, lift up the top brood chamber, put 2 pads on top of the bottom brood chamber, and close it back down. And I try to do this in a cool evening. Again, when it's not hot, the formic acid vapors will be coming out that evening. And I have minimal bee kill and hardly any queen loss following that procedure. So yeah, on the average temperature, yeah, it's generally hot in July and August, but there's always a few periods when it gets cool, relatively cool, and so you got to take advantage of those opportunities. If you can get the Formic Pro on in July, the brood that's emerging from that will not be parasitized. They'll be extremely healthy. They'll raise very healthy winter bees, and the colony will just be in great shape going through the winter. Hopefully that answered that question.
How critical is it to test post-treatment?
I think it's critical to test before and after. If you just treat, it's kind of hard to tell if you've done good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, it's it's really hard for me to answer. The concept of not testing is hard for me to fathom, honestly. And I guess that comes from, just experience. Again, I keep records. I know what the mites are before treatment, and I know what the mites are after treatment. So I know if a treatment worked or not. If you don't test before treatment and you test after treatment, then you get, let's say, 2% mites. Well, was the treatment effective or not? You don't know. If you started with 40% mites and came down to 2%, it was highly effective. But if you started with 3% mites and now you got 2% mites, it really wasn't that effective.
I'm seeing a lot of questions about nukes. So I'll summarize pretty concisely. I have nukes. What is the best way to treat? And if I'd like, can I use formic acid?
That's a good question. So I would say do not use formic acid. Do not use Formic Pro on the nukes. They're just not big enough to do that. I think that's consistent with the manufacturer's recommendation too, as I recall. And I've got a lot of nukes as well. So there I use the oxalic acid dribble, and I use Apivar strips, depending on the time of the year. A lot of my nukes are mating nukes for queen rearing. So there's a window where there's no capped brood in the nuke. You can put a queen cell in, and about 10 days after you put the queen cell in, all the capped brood has emerged after you put the queen cell in. If the queen is back and mated, she's really just laying eggs, and there might be some young larvae. So you can use oxalic acid dribble on a nuke. That seems to be highly effective. Again, there could be a queen issue with the oxalic acid dribble, or vaporization for that matter. So, but it's kind of hard to apply vaporization to a nuke. Dribble is much more controlled. You basically make a mixture that's of oxalic acid and sugar solution. You put 5 milliliters on each seam of bees, and if there's 5 frames in there, that's a maximum of 25 milliliters of the solution.
Once again, based on Terry's comment here, there's been some recent studies and products around using heat elements for Varroa management. What's your comment on that?
I saw those at ABF whenever they first came out, and didn't make sense to me, actually. I know that and I have brood minders in my colonies and other temperature and humidity sensors, right? And it's just amazing to me how well the colony regulates the temperature in the colony. If it gets too cold, they heat it up. And if it gets too warm, they cool down. And then the colony in general, but brood especially. And I think some of you seen my presentation on winterization where I had thermocouples in the brood area, and it's a flat line. The weather outside's up and down, up and down, up and down, but the temperature is constant. So if you have something in there that's trying to heat up the brood, the bees are going to work like crazy to cool it down. So you're working against the bees. I try to work with the bees, not against the bees. And I understand the concept. I haven't seen, I think that they said the study, but I haven't seen any studies showing it's effective. If I missed a study that shows it's effective, let me know. That's a lot of that's kind of a general comment. There's a lot of things that people do that they think it's great, but they don't really have the sound data to back it up.
So some people in here are this is going to be kind of like a 2-part question.
Okay.
Can you use a different medium aside from alcohol in a wash? And is there an alternative accurate way to measure mite infestation?
So let me take the second one first. The answer to that is no. A few years ago, I decided, well, I'm going to compare conning mites with an IPM board versus a sugar roll versus an alcohol wash. And I came to the conclusion pretty quickly that the alcohol wash is really, that's the only way to get an accurate mite count. And you know what? It's not 100% accurate either, because the mites are really under the brood. It just gives you an indication of how many mites are in the colony and under the brood, but that's really the best. Mite drop on an IPM board. My analogy there, it's kind of like a smoke detector. If you see mites on an IPM board, you know you got mites, but you don't know how bad it is, right? It's like a smoke detector going off. It could be just dinner's ready, or it could be the house is on fire, right? The sugar shake, after I did a few of those, why it was a mess, and I'm sure I wasn't getting the mites out because it was all clumped up and everything. So alcohol wash is really, people talk about they don't want to test. Well, if you're going to test with a sugar shake, you're fighting against yourself. Alcohol wash is the most effective. the first part of the question, different mediums. Yeah, with the pandemic that we're in now, it's hard to get isopropyl alcohol. It's really impossible at this point, right? But so I started using windshield washer fluid, and that works, but it doesn't kill the bees right away like isopropyl alcohol. And then also people have tried vinegar, and it's the same thing. It doesn't kill the bees right away. So to do an alcohol wash or any of the other washes, first you got to get the mites off the bees, and then you've got to filter the bees out of the mites, or the mites out of the bees, and so forth. So if the bees are not dying quickly, that probably gets it away too. So once, whether it's alcohol or any other medium, it turns out alcohol's really a lot easier to use, and 90% isopropyl alcohol is really the best. And again, it's kind of the case of penny wise and pound foolish. A lot of people use like 70%, or even cut the alcohol with a little bit of water. But a constant, you're depending on that mite falling through the alcohol, and not to get too technical here, but the mite is going to fall through 90% isopropyl alcohol a lot quicker than 70%, because the 70%'s got a little more water in it. The mite kind of floats a little bit more, if I can put it that way. And I've used windshield washer fluid, and they don't sink nearly as quick as either one. So I'm going to, as soon as I can get my hands on some 90% isopropyl alcohol, that's really the best. And if you're going to, it does take a little bit of time and effort, right? So you might as well use the medium that's the best. 90% isopropyl alcohol is the best. Somebody was kidding around and say they're going to use Everclear for it, but because they could get Everclear, but they couldn't get isopropyl alcohol. That'll probably work. Did that answer the question? Oh, I see one. How about vodka? Maybe. I would say, though, if you can't get alcohol, then you use windshield washer fluid. Doing a test with windshield washer fluid's a lot better than not doing a test.
I think there's a great question here from Norm. While you've mentioned parasitized drones and worker bees, do any of these ever affect the queen directly, aside from worker attrition?
Well, again, the black queen cell virus, maybe one, but that would be if they're raising a new queen. I don't know the answer to that one. The answer is it would be highly likely, right? Because in a hive where there's a lot of mite parasitism, all of a sudden there's a queen loss or a supersedure, and it's might be because the queen has been weakened with the virus. The bees are in close contact with each other, and they're all circulating around the queen. They're feeding the queen, so she more than likely picks up some of these viruses that are floating around, and that's maybe why you have some sudden queen losses. Again, I don't have a lot of information about that, but it would make sense that the queen is picking up some viruses too. Any other questions?
I think that just about covers everything.
Let's go to the next part real quick, and then we'll circle back with any remaining questions.
Perfect.
Okay, so beekeeping myth busting. After beekeeping for a while, there's a lot of myths out there. So I've been accumulating the myths, and one related to mite management and treating that I hear a lot about is that the beekeepers say, I've got a bad batch of apivar, or my mites are resistant to apivar. Are these is this true, or is this just a myth? So I've spent a little bit of time on it. There's certainly some of the people in this area think that they've had issues with Apivar, and we've got the manufacturers from Apivar out to take a look at it too. It's been about a year. I came up with a long list of possible reasons for Apivar failure, and this is maybe an engineering way of looking at failures, right? What are all the possible reasons there was a failure? In the case of Apivar, bad batch. Could have been the shipping and storage temperatures that caused the Apivar not to work as well. We talked about mite bombs, collapsing colonies in the foraging area. Misapplication. The beekeeper didn't apply it like it should have been. Packaging integrity. I talked about if the package is open, the Apivar clock starts ticking. If the package doesn't have the vacuum seal on it, the clock is ticking, right? Could it just be as simple as seasonal mite population growth, the mites being so high and the bee population being lower, and all of a sudden you see a lot more mites? Resistance or tolerance to Apivar and Amitraz is a possibility. Dosage too low, timing the application, timing the mite wash, and so forth. So, and I try to work with the manufacturers on this. Honestly, they helped me eliminate some things, but I couldn't eliminate others. But really came down to a short list of possible reasons for Apivar failure. Certainly one is mite bombs. And in this case, it's not necessarily a failure of Apivar, but the colony's getting overwhelmed with mites. Could be a bad batch of Apivar. Vito Pharma makes Apivar. They're a pharmaceutical company, and certainly around this area we've got pharmaceutical companies, so the quality assurance, quality control procedures that they have. They have retained samples of all the different product. So if you think you've got a bad batch of Apivar, let the manufacturer know the batch number. I record all the batch numbers of all the treatments I use, whether it's Formic Pro or Apivar. Oxalic acid doesn't have much of a batch number, but if I do have a problem with Apivar or Formic Pro, I know what the batch numbers are. And the manufacturers can do a much better job of helping analyze what the problem is if you give them some data like what the batch number was. So record the batch numbers that you're using. And resistance or tolerance to Apivar, specifically the Amitraz in it, is a possibility. So, I listen to the beekeepers that, I missed a slide. Sorry. So Dr. Frank Reckenvick down at the USDA in Baton Rouge is studying Apivar resistance. There's a link here. He said that Apivar resistance is rare, but he has found it in some commercial operations. I don't know how familiar you all are with some commercial operations, but they're using Amitraz in ways that really aren't approved. They've been doing it for a long time. So I don't think that anybody's really surprised that the resistance is showing up in some of these operations. But he found that there's a wide range of resistance. But while there's some resistance, Apivar remains an effective control. This is a quote from his latest research that it shows that the Amitraz remains an effective Varroa control product in many operations. Now, if you've got an operations where you've been using the years and years in a non-labeled way, it's probably not going to be effective. So what do we do? Do we put Apivar in and hope for the best? The trouble with that is a failure is not detected until 10 weeks later, right? You put it in, you do a mite test before, you put it in, you wait 2 weeks after you remove the Apivar and test again. But by then it's too late. Your mite population's exploded, and that's not my style. So I'm just thinking you need a proactive approach. and so I borrowed with pride a little bit of, how Frank Rekovic was testing in the lab the Apivar resistance, and so I, developed my own little field test for it. Take a sample. So when I was putting Apivar in a hive, I just clip off the bottom square piece of the Apivar, and I put that into this a deli container with the screen on the bottom, number 8 screen mesh on the bottom, and did the test that way. So with 300 bees, caught the mite drop after 3 hours, and then perform an alcohol wash on those bees. So you have some mites come out with the Apivar strip. You'll have the rest of the mites come out with the alcohol wash. That gives you the total number of mites. The efficacy is then how many mites you got off with the Apivar strip divided by the total. And it's considered effective if it's 80% or greater. So for example, if you put the strip in this deli container with the bees and you get 8 mites drop, you then take those bees and do an alcohol wash and you get 2 more mites. That's a total of 10. 8 divided by 10 is 80%, and you say it's effective. And this is based on Frank Rekovic's protocol. I shared this with him. He thought it was great. But by testing, if the Apivar is going to be effective. So in other words, you do this test while you're putting the Apivar in the hive. So that day whether or not you have a good batch of Apivar or not, or the bees or the mites are resistant or not. So here's a couple pictures of what I did back in January. And again, here's the setup with the Apivar strip. This is just a scale boat. Put some Vaseline in there to catch the mites that drop. Here's the container, number 8 screen on the bottom, 300 bees in here. They just cluster at the top around this Apivar strip. And so if you do this test, then, did I get a bad batch of Apivar or my mites resistant to Apivar? If you do the test and you say you don't have much mite drop, then you say, yeah, it's confirmed. You don't really know it's a bad batch or resistant. But if you get a good test, then it's busted. So there was animation on these for to pop up. But again, I hate feeling like a victim of, not knowing for 10 weeks if it's Apivar is effective or not. And so that this test is one way to do that. And if you find that you've got mites that are resistant to Apivar, Frank Rekovic wants to talk with you. He wants to see those bees. He's looking for mites that are resistant to Apivar. So here's some more resources that you can use. And again, if this will be in the copy that I'll send you if you email me. And they're all very good. The Vito Pharma video here talks about how to properly apply it and scraping the strips and so forth. The Bee Informed Partnership has got a lot of good information. There's a lot more information here on the bee health for viruses and so forth too. The Honey Bee Health Coalition has put together a really good guide for managing Varroa. Every beekeeper should have this and refresh their understanding of this document periodically, at least every year. So with that, that's a presentation.
You have one more new question that has come in. So if you are using an alternative fluid for your mite wash, like windshield wiper fluid or vodka, does the amount of time that you shake the bees change?
The amount of time you shake the bees? I haven't changed the amount of time to shake the bees. I just know that it takes more time for the mites. Once they're separated from the bees, it takes a little more time for them to fall through the fluid. And, in 90% isopropyl alcohol, they drop like little rocks. In windshield washer fluid, they drop like, no, something is closer to the density of water, if you understand what I'm saying. So I'm seeing the chat now.
Yeah.
Does screens and cover-up set ventilation impact formic acid efficacy? So yeah, so formic acid is heavier than air, and if you have a screen bottom board, you need to close that screen bottom board so that it all doesn't drop straight out of the hive. Other treatments like Apigard, same thing. You need to close those IPM boards to keep the vapors in the hive for it to be effective. If the bottom board's open, it's just going to fall out the bottom of the hive and probably not be nearly as effective, if at all. I guess the question is, can there be too much ventilation, larger top entrances? Yeah, maybe. You probably shouldn't have a large top entrance anyway. But that's kind of a separate subject. A tickler there. I'm finding out that top entrances aren't quite as important as what everybody was, I'll say, assuming, including during the winter. But I'll have that in the winterization presentation next time.
See, I think we're just about nearing up on the end here.
Yeah. So, again, I've been dealing with mites like a lot of you for quite a few years, and at first I struggled, like I'm sure a lot of people did with mites, and what's effective treatments and how to do it, and so I ended up with I think a plan that works really well for me. It's worked well for me for a few years now, and it's also integrated into a lot of the rest of my beekeeping plan. It's integrated into extracting honey and removing supers. And it's also integrated into, again, I like to put fall queens in my colonies for a number of reasons. And so, I'm not too upset if I lose a queen with Formic Pro in July or August because it's going to requeen anyway. Formic acid, I have had large bee kills with formic acid. My observation anyway is that it seems like a colony that doesn't have a lot of mites doesn't have a lot of bee kills, and that's because a colony that doesn't have a lot of mites doesn't have a lot of viruses, doesn't have a lot of bees that are weak. A colony that has a lot of mites, those are weak, sick bees, and those are the ones that get killed by the formic acid vapors. Any other
questions?
So a lot of information. Again, email me if you like a copy of the presentation. It might take a couple days, but I'll get that out to you. I've got a lot of confidence in my mite management plan. I had a couple people pick up some nukes for me, and I gave them that mite management plan and basically told them if they follow that mite management plan, that nuke will be good and strong all summer. It'll survive the winter and build up great next year. I'd put my money where my mouth was, but I can't control everything the beekeeper's doing. But I've got a lot of confidence in that plan. All right. Well, listen, I really appreciate everybody's attention. And present kind of a long presentation, a lot of information here, but hopefully I've given you a good understanding of the dynamics of mite populations and bee populations and what the root cause is of colony losses. It's not a cold snap or a false spring. Most of the colonies that die during the winter die because of Varroa. Certainly you have to do, and you can do. There's some things you have to do, and there's some things that are optional during the winter, but keeping the mite levels low is mandatory for preventing colony losses. And including during the summer. Beekeepers talk about colonies just becoming dinks. You have 3 colonies together, and the 4th colony, 3 colonies produce honey, and the 4th one doesn't. Well, it makes me wonder if it's because of mite population.
John, Charlie is actually, he has a copy of the treasurer's report from Patty, so we're just gonna quickly do that before we end this.
Okay.
Hey, can you hear me, Justin?
Yes, I can.
Oh, excellent. So you're leading the meeting tonight. Mike is not. You are, right?
Mike needs to get his microphone to work.
Okay. Well, that may be a challenge, but all right. So let me just find it here. Patty emailed me her treasurer's report. She said she would not be able to make the meeting tonight, so said that I would. So what she indicates, her opening balance as of 5/1/2020 was $8,285. Our closing balance, money market, at the ending balance as of 5/31/2020, $8,177.85.
Yep. You can you send me a copy of that, Charlie? Your connection's not great. I'll upload it.
Okay. I'll send it to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody that came on out, and thank you so much, John. Really,
all right, thank you,
really
everyone.
excellent presentation.
My pleasure. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, John.
I will go ahead and end the meeting for you, John.
Okay.
Thank you so much again. Really, like this was great.
No, thanks.